And all I'm saying by way of introduction is that the personality of Jesus as a human being who was wandering around Galilee and talking to people who were wrestling with problems about the gods, the Greco-Roman gods, their own God as Jews, who was the God, the creator of the Bible, and just life being miserable because of the conflicts and so on, which show us that humans have not changed. So the starting point is acknowledging what I call ecological grief in my book as the underlying reason for the coming up of a theological discourse in which women are central and can be considered part of from the beginning of the origins of Christianity. Not only did Jesus have friends, it's well noted by scholars, feminists and otherwise, that he made friends with people from very different sectors of society, but most of them living in the shadows, if you like, of a Greco-Roman civilization because of the history at the time. So where do women fit in? I'm trying to say that the result of conquest, violence, the oppression, the displacement of people, which Jesus was addressing, all began really with what I call the deviance of divine reason by people who were believing in the gods. So I'm just going to go straight into Africa and talk about how this is some things about human nature don't change. It doesn't matter where we are on the planet. Some things don't change. We are learning today from a small group of people called the Karanga, Shona speaking in Zimbabwe, and again to reflect the global climate in which we all around the world need to rethink what we mean by God in relation to creation and ethics in particular, things that we do in our day-to-day world, is that the collector of this is actually a Swedish medical doctor who was a missionary in Zimbabwe many years ago, before I was even born. So he collected these mythologies, and I'm going to just use them to help us to rethink this. And why? Most of these Shona tradition, African traditional religions, the goal was to vanquish them. And so with that, a way of learning about deeper questions was destroyed. Now I'm trying to move my PowerPoints. I can't move them. Can you help me over there? I think something has been done to freeze my PowerPoints. So you guys can see?
We can see it, yes.
Nice and clear? Okay, good.
Yeah.
So it's for my reading, so I'm not going to enlarge it or anything in case we get frozen again.
Okay, that's fine.
All right, all right. So basically we are saying that one of the things that got missed in Christian theology once we came to the 2nd and the 3rd century is that the oral traditional patterns for spreading the good news of Jesus got lost in the effort made by the church fathers, the earliest theologians, to legitimate Christianity in a society ruled by people who placed a higher value on reading the classics and knowing their Greek philosophy and Greek and Hebrew and so on. So if you were textually savvy and ready for philosophical discussions of the meaning of Christianity, that won the day. And the long story short is with that, we not only lost the women's gift of knowledge and ability to express what Jesus was about, but also we lost the character of Christianity insofar as it has a very profound message for our humanity when it comes to certain words of wisdom as regards how we should be in this world. So what I've done very quickly, and I'm trying to cut the time by lost by just getting into it, is that I'm going to use my idea of African tradition. And I'm seeing, yes, so this time the PowerPoints are working. Karen Armstrong, I'm not ashamed because I'm now a global citizen, ashamed of reading many, many books from the West and the non-West and world religions to talk about things. Karen Armstrong's book is very interesting. It's a little book called A History of Myth. And she writes in there that human beings are meaning-seeking creatures. Like poetry and music, mythology should awaken us to rapture, even in the face of death and despair, as we may feel at the prospect of annihilation. So things go bad in the world. And telling stories and creating a format by which you can actually be retelling stories about how we can learn to be human is lost to Western civilization. And I'm saying when it comes to Africa, we've lost the voices of women in this regard, because traditionally it was the woman who sits down, who sings a song and may tell children stories in order to educate them about the divine principles around which they can navigate in this world, caring for their neighbor, not being cruel, behaving themselves, respecting elders, and all that stuff comes from Shona mythology. So we want to do our African theology, in this case, centered on women. I don't use the label feminist myself, by the way. I'm a woman scholar of religion. And yes, of course, I empathize with women, but I'm not using a label which I know is coming from the Western world just for the sake of it. Here's an example of oral traditional theaters of knowledge. Just as you might imagine Jesus walking around or telling the Sermon on the Mount, or even grieving at Gethsemane just before he's crucified, you can imagine people sitting around the fire and thinking through what it means to believe in God. It's not about textuality in this case, but knowing what the text says in the light of real life questions, and creating an atmosphere in which the learning can not just be equitable, but user-friendly to that. And I'm saying this when we say women are the guardians of wisdom, or were the guardians of wisdom in the traditional culture, this is what we mean. It was not about standing up and impressing people with strong arguments and so on. It was about sitting down and the elders taking a leadership role in terms of transmitting knowledge about the ancestors, about Earth, about the animal kingdom, and letting people arrive at the inner truth of it so that we have a better world, a more peaceful society. These traditional stories were told in front of the male elders, in front of children, in front of anyone who was there in the hut to listen, and sometimes out in the open air to listen to what it was. And I think that's something that I associate with the source of knowledge for theology, and also what I think is the character, social character of doing theology. Doing means doing, being, and doing means there has to be surely a social character to the theological process of ideas, so that they're shared right from the beginning. We have a problem of colonial conquest as the context in which we develop a kind of divine deviance from divine reason, I would call it. A deviance is very, very human, and I think it's found in the Karanga mythology. I'm going to briefly summarize in a minute. That is, human beings failing to see that when it comes to the main point of Jesus' message to the world or to people around him was very contrary to the idea of creating a Christendom, i.e., a world in which God can be worshipped by people who travel around having. So something goes on in this, because with this transition into the modern era in which we are now doing theology, you have the vanquishing of the women as agents of knowledge in African culture, not intentionally, but it happened. And it's not about avoiding it, but in order to make us really conscious of how deep we need to dig if we're going to develop an understanding of women's role in doing theology since the end of Jesus. I took two pictures here. One of them is Lagos, just to show what has happened since the transformation of Africa into a patriarchal world. Again, this is ignorant deviance from divine reason. It is also progress. So we are not saying we want to run away from what has happened. We are able to talk today thanks to the technology. So we're not running away, but let's be attentive to how the human ego, besides just being violent and greedy and self-centered, can actually create has created a global society in which Christianity should be studied in full awareness of the social changes that happen and the types of people who need to be convinced first of the need to change their way of being Christian, but also doing theology. And I deliberately just gave pictures. There's a lot of literature from Zimbabwe where my stories of creation are going to come from, whereby the background, the new background, Jesus had his own background, which I described earlier, of the Roman Empire, the violence, the patriarchalism, the insistence on a kind of patriarchal logic to the way things should be ordered in the world so that they are hierarchical. And then we have now here in the context for revisiting the question of women as theologians, very natural theologians. We have here an ignorance deviance to do with the patriarchalism, ideas of power, fighting for rights. You shouldn't have to fight for your rights. It should be something that comes with understanding what it means to be human in order to arrive at that. Then the idea of a dying world, things only get worse. We not only have the human ego standing in the way of divine reason, we also have this kind of problem. Right now, I think it's in Oxford, there's a small college there that has started a project on climate change. Its name is so they asked about mining in Africa, they said, so that I can reflect on the problems of the ecological crisis. This is one of the problems of ignorant deviance, and not on the part of the African, but the idea of a world in which we depend for our living from this extractive wealth that comes from industrial image. It complicates the human condition. It also reminds us of the fact that Jesus was a very open air man. He lived on the margins of society, but also he was very grounded in nature in the way he talked about. He prompted us to remember about the way the world in which we live as believers should look like, certainly not like this. Imagine him walking around seeing that and what kind of message is saying. So back to wisdom, I would say, back to the divine wisdom, back to the divine guardians of wisdom. And I'm saying the Karanga because you don't want to generalize in your scholarship. even if you mean to make a global point, a point that anyone with common sense should be able to follow and appreciate. You don't want to generalize in terms of your sources of knowledge, where the ideas are coming from. Just a thought, so that we know that I know the limits of what I'm saying, and it may not be relevant to everybody, but it is certainly part of that. However, I took this picture actually from the streets around here, and you'll be surprised. I live in a nice neighborhood close to the university. I acquired habits such as riding bicycles, and I jog in the morning. And whenever I do that, this is what I see on the underside of this society. People so grieving because of the same kind of things of wanting to extract wealth, a whole economy, a whole global economy centered on this, that it creates displacement to this level and so on. So I just thought I would give you that picture of displacement, a failed order of existence that is social, but also ecological. That's why I said the dying world, and the same applies here. In other words, wherever I am in this world, I will watch out for the poor and the oppressed and people who are voiceless. They are my agents of knowledge, because surely they are expecting of God, or thinking about someone like Jesus as somebody who would be compassionate enough to care about them, as somebody who would have wandered through the margins of society and recognize that love and compassion are some of those characteristics that shape Christianity. Okay, so where is the wisdom coming from? I am saying that the wisdom is coming from a vanquished era of women fulfilling a central role. And I will stick to the Karanga to avoid being accused of generalizing about African women and so on. So here is a myth number one. I have the book here where these stories are collected, and I'm using them to write my book on climate change and theology with an African perspective, and without any apology, showing that it is telling the whole globe a message about how you can look at things. This is the story of the breath of life, Samu Tutu, told obviously in pre-Christian times and remembered by a group of people who then led this scholar to write them down, because he was thinking of Genesis, and they were saying, well, Genesis is interesting, but surely we can tell you more. And among the more that he found is this one about the breath of life. I'm going more ecological, my friends, with this, because it's not just about femininity and gender. It's also about how we, with our gift of life and senses as sentient beings, respond to the world around us. Myth number one, breath of life. This is a story told in among the Karanga concerning the origins of life. It would have been told by a woman, that's the significance of it, but the beauty of it is that it's inclusive in its meaning and purpose, because we all need to breathe oxygen, don't we? And Samu Tutu is a story by which a living being, anthropomorphized to look like a man, in fact, lands on earth, and he breathes, finds that he was asleep, but when he wakes up, and he has to breathe in some oxygen in order to breathe. He also does something else, because he's a little confused. We're talking almost like an Adam before he has the common sense to know that he was going to sin kind of time. So the way Samu Tutu therefore describes the omnipresence of the divine, the omnipresence of God in the, so that people realize the preciousness of life when we have it on earth. It does correspond with how you're going to relate to other living things, to fellow human beings, is in particular when we are made concerned in this kind of talk. Humans themselves, if they cannot relate to one another as people sharing the same breath, we're not going anywhere. And in case you're saying, what kind of academic is this? I am in this moment a storyteller, somebody who likes to tell stories, who is living out the idea that in mythology, we actually learn more about divine reason if we take our time to listen and to feel and to sense things around us, we feel more. So the story of Psalm 22 actually ends showing that there is this God that breathes life into earth and breathes life into the human being, and they become awakened and they are conscious of God. The only problem at the end of the myth is that the human makes the mistakes of thinking that they are in dominion of the world in which they are finding themselves. So they are amazed by the beauty of everything around them, and we may as well move to the next one, because one of the beauty of these stories of creation is how interlinked it is. So man, from the origins of the evolution of human beings on earth, starts to respond to being in the world with problems, certain weaknesses of deviance, of divine reason, involving greed, for example, killing, becoming jealous. All the 10 commandments are part of the instinctive reaction of man from creation onwards. And by man here, we're not talking about masculine, we're just talking, Musikavanu means the making of people, actually, in this case. So reminding us of the air that we breathe brings into it a kind of eco-sensitive mentality towards creation. The second one, Musikavanu, is about looking at the sunrise. Again, it's the first human being arriving on Earth. This one apparently had a bunch of eggs in their pocket. And they looked at the sun because when they landed, it was dark and they didn't know what to do with themselves. But they looked at the sun and heard the voice telling them to look further around them because they were worried about something to eat. And they turned around and they found that there was everything growing and rivers, mountains, and so on. And it's told like a story of evolution in which the opening of the eyes of the human means you must know, you must look around you. And by the way, African traditional women in the pre-colonial times, at least as far as I know, the Karanga, they took pride in their labors of going out in the open air, finding the firewood, knowing what's good wood and what's bad wood, making the most of the sunrise to go and fetch water. And through this, I find in the contemporary practice of the Masoe apostles I'm going to end with, that you have now a form of Christianity that is taking more of this traditional ambiance of just looking at God as someone around whom you can reflect from human conditions of displacement. Anyway, light in Shona means not just the light itself in that we are able to see as human beings, but it's also associated with wisdom, being able to think through what you are seeing, observe, learn, and then you can act. So the word ruziwo means knowledge, is associated with ziwo, which i.e. the Zua, the rising sun and the rise that sets. And surely the light that we see is an ancient image used to highlight the transcendence of God in Plato. So it's not new under the sun. So basically, There's theology. We just missed it in the context of the rise of the imperial era, and it is very much to do with women. In this last image here, I have a woman who is pregnant, and beside her is a rock. And I actually love the symbolism of nature itself, that there's a whole dictionary there of creation around which we can rethink the order of things. And I'm not the only one saying this. There's some great intellectuals in Oxford. Keith Ward is one of them, a very strong evangelical Christian, talking about the rethinking of order, editing books. I'm seeing this all the time. Gaia and climate change, the gift of life, and all this kind of thing is coming out of Western scholarship, because even they are seeing also the need to rethink their understanding of the meaning of somebody like Jesus. They need to do their Christology all over again. Mairedu is coterminous with saying our Mother Earth, if you like. In this case, this story, Mairi, who is the one who is there, ultimately the mystery around which we can understand nature. Mairi speaks to Mairedu. Mairedu is the womb of Earth. Earth becomes like a womb of creation. Why? Because there is life on Earth. There's a planet. And the image of the feminine is used to kind of give us a sense of containment around Earth as a place in which life can be nurtured, so that the human can also recognize the importance of nurturing life. Now, I'm not saying get rid of your car and don't go to the subway and things like that. I am saying let's be simple about it in terms of how we approach one another as living things in the light of mistakes already made in our human civilization concerning the idea of us having so much power, we can manipulate the forces of nature so as to industrialize the whole societies, create oppression, enslave people, and so on, and still talk about God. Have fancy buildings where we can go and talk about God. So this is a wonderful story of Mairedu, not just being female to depict Earth, but she's holding a conversation with the one who is there. I.e., are we gonna eat something on this planet? And then God said, oh yeah. And then said, are we gonna have children? And then God said, oh yeah, there is a male for you, and so on. Now, do these stories clash with Genesis? I am arguing that they don't, because Genesis is a story selected by a certain group of people in order to correspond with a tradition that was evolving around the idea of the sacred text. Otherwise, let's be honest, the ancient times in which this idea of telling stories for pedagogical reasons, of educating one another in terms of where humans stand in this world in relation to one another, is as thousands of pagan stories, ancient stories, that around which Genesis would have been picked as a story that depicted and also, even if you read it, there are two stories of Genesis. One says a lot of we, and is used by Saint Augustine to suggest that we are made in the image of God, even if the male is the dominant in that, and others where it looks like more emphasizing male patriarchy. So we can dialogue basically with confidence using African ideas about motherhood, about life on earth, but more into, and I'm saying here, philosophical ideas behind the storytelling of mythology, which is globally recognized that the mythologies we tell have a function. It's not that they're false, as some of my students tell me, but they have a function. of probing us to think more deeply on what best to do. It's like my favorite story of a lion and an elephant spending all day on a tug of war, forgetting that they can't win it because they're both very strong. And then it takes a little rabbit to come and say, "Hey, guys, haven't you figured it out?" And then they stop their conflict because they have somebody who is otherwise invisible. In this case, the world in which we are, women have become invisible. Now, Jaye, how am I doing for time? Because I don't like to exceed time. I love conversation more than I love to kind of deliver speeches. So how am I going for time?
Are you doing very well for time? Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So do I have a few more minutes?
You have all the time you need. So
Oh,
do
look
carry
at
on.
you. We want to hear these buddies of mine who are with you in your club. I want to hear from them soon. So
Oh,
anyway,
sure. Yes. I'll
let me.
encourage them to ask questions in a minute. But
Okay.
yeah, but do please go ahead. Yes. Don't
So,
feel under pressure.
all right. So basically, there are many stories of creation. And what I did was, in my search for my African identity, actually, and my sense of purpose, I was just tired of having theology shoved down my throat and feeling like I'm ignorant because I couldn't reconcile myself to the way it matched my living as an African. I felt excluded, and at the same time I was reading all this fancy stuff I now teach sometimes, because I enjoy listening to other people talk, doing their divine reasoning. However, I disagree with it insofar as it has supported a patriarchal world. So let's go into a patriarchal world that doubles itself in Africa because of the traditional patriarchies that were also there. When it comes to the Karanga, you have a powerful African male lineage system onto which the colonial conquest and the introduction of Christianity reaffirm the patriarchal character of Christianity. Now, it's not about male, female, who stands for, who is the leader of the church, must they be male? It's the disposition with which you operate. Just like Jesus presents us with the disposition to others, including women, that makes everybody comfortable. So don't say I'm destroying the church, okay, afterwards. So Karanga mythology and their wonderful stories of creation and others about the suffering and death associated with this ignorant deviance from divine reason, causing people to become greedy, selfish, jealous. So they go around doing bad things, including witchcraft, in the name of trying to manipulate forces of nature, which ultimately it's a gift which we can celebrate and can never, I don't think, fully comprehend. Right now over here, they've been going to Mars again, I guess, somewhere in space. And it's exciting. People are paying money. And I'm thinking, we haven't even finished understanding Earth. And there we are out there. Now, this picture I took on Guardians, Women as Guardians of Wisdom, because I Googled it and I found that it said noisy Masoes in London somewhere or in England. That's because you can see the male preacher up there. He's standing his head, he's shouting in the name of the Holy Spirit, and the women are kneeling there quietly and so on. When I did my research for the book I wrote on Masoe apostles, by the way, I wanted to break from Western theology. So I said, I'm just going to hang out with a group of these strange people that were just kept seeing them. I said, I better follow them and find out what theology they do, because I was having questions and I was amazed by how theologically savvy they were. Because walking to the wilderness, which is what the word Masoe means, is a theological exercise itself. by which you're not only connecting with the environment around you, the created order around you. A lot of the women start to share their questions about God, their problems in life with children, with husbands, and even they critique sermons. Like, if you can see, there's a woman there who is basically saying, "Oh, isn't he noisy?" or something, because sometimes things can get over the top with this confidence that we know the Holy Spirit, we know what God is saying, and we're telling you people what it is. So this is a movement which shows that actually the collision between a Western format of presenting Christianity among the Karanga to their preferred model of faith, by which you don't play the hierarchy, but you sit and you listen to somebody, male or female, but you share ideas, and they are open to question. Because in the walk into the wilderness and the walk back home, these women are smart enough to say, well, this is what I'm looking for spiritually. Surely God doesn't make other people more special than others. And they're notorious for suggesting that male, female, child, grown up, we are all equal before God. And all of this, my friends, I'm just saying, it's inspired by looking or listening to stories of the gospel, whether they were missionaries preaching them or fellow Africans retelling them or reading the stories in church. This led to the rise of an oral audience and an oral tradition of Christianity where women act as the guardians of wisdom. They don't have to displace their male leaders, but I have listened to them talk about the meaning of the concept of God. I have seen that they are really alert when the male preachers, sometimes they start to name women things in the name of being inspired to fight evil and call women witches and stuff like that. You find that these women are very smart in that they can also think in terms of Jesus, in terms of love, in terms of compassion, and of course, they are your typical Jesus candidates, because the Masoe, by going to the wilderness, they are already saying, we are part of a dying world. We are suffering. At the same time, we have hope in this message, in salvation. And it's nothing like Jenkins says that, oh, they're so conservative or they're so Pentecostal. You find that Masoe are most of the time very thoughtful, sitting down. Yes, you have sometimes the loud one speaking, but the majority of women do not preach, but they are guardians of wisdom in that they balance the discussion. When it gets too loud, the women start singing and things get up okay. Now, just to close, this movement has been around for 100 years. In fact, I'm writing my book on theology and climate change just to celebrate this kind of phenomenon of Christianity on the continent. It's widespread in Southern Africa, but also in Central Africa. And I think there are versions of the white-robed Christians in West Africa. So there's nothing new to West-robed. It's just a matter of connecting the dots between these particular guardians of wisdom whose theology is very earth-friendly, mother-friendly, but in an inclusive manner for men and women, that I think it's in this global era where certain kinds of problems are predominant, they're worth talking about. And in case whoever wrote the article for one of your newspapers thinks they are noisy, when I first encountered them, they were making noise too in Harare outside my house. Across the road was a dry meadow and there was a fire. I said, who was lighting a fire at 11 p.m. I'm supposed to finish my thesis. I'm trying to work late hours. And there they were. The man was the one shouting, of course, and then the women were singing, and they can go on for hours. That's why I think that they have a wonderful way of reviving the oral traditional understanding of Christianity that begins with Jesus's words. They spend hours at it. You can be spending all night. These they call pungwes. You go at night out there somewhere in the open air, and the walk is important. The sitting down is important. The moments in between are important. Mothers, women, and children are important. And men can shout as much as they like. It doesn't mean that everything they say is correct. Why? Because oral traditional is the search for meaning rather than pointing to dogma. So I've heard God is the Father, da 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 da, and powerful language, but it hasn't changed the fact that women are quite comfortable listening to it, and as critical thinkers, that sometimes the men notice and they stop. And the Masoe have actually a group of women elders who are associated with the voice of God, i.e., in between the lines, there is always the real voice of God when we are practicing Christianity, and sometimes missing the point because we are only too human. We can't be perfect and we can't be knowing everything. I'll stop with this picture on ignorant deviance and divine reason, because I am trying to say the story of the wind and the light is knowledge and wisdom and so on, whilst very, very African and coming from a tiny group of people out there in Zimbabwe whom I only met twice. Otherwise, I spent my time doing research with these Masoes and so on, is important to recognize in a world in which the African, since we are the majority members of this new world where Christianity is, we owe it to the global society to do some deep theology, where we don't just play on being African, but recognize the context is now a global one. We're not only being watched as theologians, but we have a religiously pluralistic world in which the ignorant deviance of and divine reason create real scope for dialogue, for meditation, and contemplation on what the meaning of God is in our world. I think I will stop with this again. I began with it. Karen Armstrong writes, mythology has not been a placeholder for science through the ages, rather a rich and profound way of engaging the world and exploring the human conditions. So my friends, let's keep telling the story of Jesus, even if you're doing it vaguely, because you are not reading the Bible. I too have gone to church, I confess. I just like listening to the songs, watching them walk up and down in their nice clothes, and going up for communion. And for me, all that is a subject of thought. I need to reflect on it always as a theologian. Not that it's not unfulfilling for me spiritually, but let us remember sometimes the stories that become the placeholder for Christianity, and from which we can learn to engage the world and explore the human condition. There she goes. I don't care about this question, but I care about this. Thanks. And easy, I took the day off my classes because I thought, well, these friends of mine, we can talk for a little while afterwards. Is that okay, Presider? Shall I turn off these PowerPoints and come back so I can see everyone? Yeah, yes. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that lecture. That was very fascinating, very enlightening, and presents a lot of new perspectives, I would say. Definitely for me, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same for some of our attendees. It's raised a few questions, and I will, no questions yet from our attendees, so perhaps I'll begin with one. As you were presenting, my mind was going back to sort of the Near Eastern mythologies, which were very sort of apparent in the Genesis creation stories, and in which the Genesis creation stories kind of disrupted the Near Eastern mythological stories about how creation evolved. I'm wondering whether is there any way in which the Karanga mythologies or African mythologies at any point challenge the sort of dominant, let's try say, Western sort of interpretation of the creation stories, or at least give us a different way of interpreting them than what we presently have. Any sort of points of divergence as such? I think you're on mute.
Unmute. So,
yes,
okay,
we can hear you now. Yes.
Yeah. So I think it's a very good question to help us remember. Maybe it was not so much in Nigeria and other places in West Africa where colonialism happened so fast and people regretted it and left. But if you're coming from Southern Africa, this was a very deliberate, methodologically sound way by which the ignorant deviance in knowledge of divine reason prompted the total destruction of the structures for the practice of the traditional religion. Children now needed to go to school. It's required to go to school and spend as much time as you can in school. And most of these schools were run by missionaries. If you're in Zimbabwe, some really fine missionary established school when it comes to literacy and learning about the Western way of being human as Africans. So what it means is that, yes, it could have intervened and may have, but once the conquest took hold of the whole culture and whole generations of Africans moving forward, including ourselves who can barely remember what happened, we take Christianity for granted as the religion with which to embrace modernity. We may talk a little about African tradition, we love it, but it's not in keeping with or viable to reintroduce once you have been converted to Christianity around social change. There's a Michael Budilon who wrote a book on social change in Zimbabwe, and he said, where are our ancestors? And because he was questioning the deep way in which the society completely changed through urbanization, through missionary schooling, or even just schooling, public schooling, in order to alter this past. Some countries more than others. So no, it's actually a great treasure to find this collection of stories. Someone spent time digging through women who could remember them so they could put them in a book.
Thank you for that.
Okay.
I have a question here. Isabel, please talk to us about the prophetic in the Karanga or other mythologies. So that's the question.
A kind of prophetic message, prophet. I would say that the messages are prophetic now. If you're looking at Christianity in the light of its history of the way it was spread, so they can be seen to be containing a prophetic message now, And yes, the Masoe, these people who sit outdoors and they like to just kind of do their theology in the open air, are led by prophets, i.e., people whose insights into the critique of Christianity and the story of Jesus. Oh, by the way, the founder of the Masoe himself talked a lot about suffering and dying using Shauna, so much so that he sounded like he was saying, I'm a Jesus. But he spared himself by saying, I am John the prophet, I'm Johanna the prophet, i.e., I'm reminding people of an alternative lens for looking at God so we don't associate it with our own oppression and things like that. So it's a good question because it took a prophet, is somebody who is so moved by the difficulties that surround them, by their grieving, if you like, for a dying world, that they re-dramatize the knowledge of the New Testament. So I think it's prophetic. Whether the world was going to listen to it, I don't know. But it is definitely, there's something prophetic in this retranslation of these stories today.
Good, thank you very much. Another question here. Do you consider Adam, or the first man, to be a black man?
To be honest with you, I really don't care.
Well, that's an honest and direct answer.
I guess if you were doing Darwin's theory of evolution, he was a black man. He was a black man. But I think we need to rise, we need to be the noble ones here and recognize that the deeper questions are the same. They're applying to all human nature, whoever they were to begin with. And that is what you're saying, what this person is saying, would fit in with this theory of evolution. But then these stories are not saying we need to pick up an Adam. They're just saying there was some beginning in the evolution of things by which Earth appeared, humans appeared. In one of the stories, the first human who appeared, the Adam-like person who appeared, lands in water, and he finds out there are lots of fish in there already, i.e. there are other living creatures already flourishing in the water. So again, it's a way of warning us of the need to recognize our place in the general created universe. But let's not use race so much that it plays against us when we are responsible for speaking in a way that anyone, imagine people in India, people in China who are living with oppression and so on. These are human beings turning to the same Jesus message and are looking for points of conversation that are uplifting spiritually rather than the race. Maybe it's because I'm living in America. This is a big thing, you know, black this, black white this, black this, white this. And I'm thinking sometimes we need to be deeper. I showed you a picture of the men who are covered with their face. I see them every day when I go running, and they are white people. But that's not why I talk to them. I talk to them because if I was imagining the world in which Jesus was, I should express my compassion to the stranger.
Absolutely.
You see what I mean?
Absolutely.
It makes sense, especially talking to you guys living in England like that. Be the smart ones to show that as Africans, we can actually rise above these issues and go to the deeper message, because that it's challenging enough as it is. And explains why Christianity is now very traditional in Africa.
I have an attendee who's got a raised hand. Miss Gabby Williams, would you like to speak? You're on.
Yeah, I can see her.
Yes. Would you like? There. You had your hand raised.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, is it me? Oh, I see. No, that was a mistake.
Oh.
I asked a question. But I did ask another question. Thank you so much, Isabel.
Oh,
I asked about the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil are so central to Christianity. And how is that issue resolved? Those two conflicting paths. How is that issue resolved in the mythologies you've presented to us?
It's very good. I think, sorry, I interrupted you there. I think the mythology free us from thinking that you can read a story of Genesis and be so dogmatic about what happened, because it's pre-scientific, my friends. It's pre-scientific way of talking about how things happened. So to apply this kind of technical kind of sense, it says this and not that, and so on, becomes a problem. And I think the mythology, because there are up to 11 stories of creation, all involving an Adam-like figure, shows that we are being helped to get away from the idea of being stuck with the tree of knowledge thing. And by the way, the Gnostics had a different way of looking at the tree of knowledge, even in the early church, because for them, the tree of knowledge was actually a good thing for Adam. She was being warned by Eve that there is such a thing as good and evil. And of course, he didn't listen, and then things went wrong. That's a kind of Gnostic way of it, because they associate the divine wisdom with the feminine, Sophia. Again, we're going ancient times in which Genesis would have come. Sophia was an ancient idea of divine wisdom, knowledge of God that is divine, but it's feminine, and she's the mother of earth, actually, and she's the mother of the creator of the world, who thinks he rules everything. So Gnostic stuff has to come in there. But I wouldn't even want to go there with this when it comes to the freedom we are getting out of dogmatism by looking at Karanga mythology. 11 stories, beautiful stories, each one ending with a lesson on the tree of knowledge, if you like, by saying that something goes wrong with our human understanding. We get carried away with it, and then we start wanting to have dominion on earth, and we start doing things to show that we are only self-interested in ourselves. And I think some of this is just normal. It could have been contained in the past. It's just that we've reached a point in human civilizations coming together where we have so much Christianity, but also lots of problems to resolve that are cross-cultural and must be respectful of other stories of creation. There are wonderful stories out there, actually. Wish I could write and go around collecting them if I had money. Because the purpose is to teach us to be human and have good relationships in the world. It's not about the dogma. They can actually shift as well insofar as they are oral traditional stories, i.e., it's a school, it's a way of thinking around the fireplace, if you like. As members of the same society. Yeah. Okay.
So let me ask another question. How do you think we could be, how can we develop a more sort of meditative, contemplative spirituality in Africa? Because it's our Christianity seems to be much more practical, much more sort of, about doing rather than sort of being and being more meditative and contemplative. Why do you think that's we haven't developed that as much?
Well, I think the challenge is for people who are church leaders to rethink constructively how they structure their worship, for example, so that it allows the oral traditional vibe, which is already there, by the way. Whenever I visit African church, I really feel it. I can feel that people, the way they engage the sermons and so on, is very oral traditional. And it's nothing to look down upon, by the way, because that is actually the problem of the West now. They're caught up with arguments of secularization. They can barely distinguish the baby and the bathwater. So we want to be able to see through that. So I think it's up to the leadership, perhaps have a conference. I would love if the World Council of Churches maybe even met around this. How do we, in an ecological era like this one, it's called the Anthropocene, by the way, meaning that human activities have led to this point in the history of the planet that it is itself in peril, i.e. human life, other forms of life, and everything. Planet Earth could actually come to an end, so because of human activities. And even if you think that that is not the case, so human activities are important, very good, but they need to begin with the contemplative, an outlook on prayer, an outlook on prayer that is not just giving God a shopping list, but more meditative. And I found these women I followed around. When I was bored on Sundays, I would just follow around, that they were really great thinkers. And I was thinking, gosh, this sounds like Thomas Aquinas. This sounds like, whoa! But they were just talking orally about their experiences of the world, and guided by the fact that they were actually going to worship, i.e. put it before God what it is. And for a lot of them, by the time they started praying, they were okay. The healing was already happening through dialogue, through conversation, through walking together, and not so much counting on the authority of the one who's going to lead the service, but have trust in fellow human beings in having the same search and be more side by side. I get worried by the commodification of Christianity. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Rather than a knowledge system from which everyone benefits. And the liberation theologians in Latin America, 70s, 80s, they were on about this kind of, let's be practical with the knowledge. It leads to certain kinds of relationships that are not there in conditions of oppression. So you've got to bring dialogue. South Africa was transformed by Christianity. You know that?
Yeah.
Desmond Tutu, Nobel Prize winner. Very simple. I listened to him in London once. I almost choked. I said, is this all he can tell us, that Jesus loved the poor and the sick, and therefore apartheid is wrong? It's so simple. but he was pointing to a way of life, and look how it transformed the whole social structure. Not that I know what's going on now. I've heard some disturbing things, but the challenge is a very strong one, emphasized by the South African case, actually, that you can have Christianity become part of social change, help with social change. And then, but the ignorant deviance keeps hitting at us. So we still have corruption, we still have sexism, we still have violence. And so, well, what does it mean? It means that those of you involved in leading churches really have a tough job of rethinking Christianity with this African perspective of a world that is profoundly kind of scarred, a dying world. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think we don't have any more questions, so I think that would be an opportunity to say, Dr. Bella, thank you very much for what was a really fascinating and really enlightening and presentation. I've certainly learned a lot of new things, and I look forward to reading your book when it does come out and deepening my knowledge on African Christianity and African feminist Christianity as well, even though you don't like to call yourself a feminist, but I like to read more about the role of African women in the development of Christianity in the continent. So
Yeah.
thank you very much. And thank you all of you for participating and attending this webinar. And I look forward to having you at the next one when it is out. And I'll certainly keep you posted. So thank you very much and goodbye to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bella.
Thanks. You take good care. Thanks.
I will do.
Yeah,
You too.
good.
Take care.
Good luck with your stuff. Yeah.
Thank you.